The medical wing of Sunspire Academy hummed with an unusual tension. Jade Park stood near the massive transparent wall, her dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, eyes fixed on the patient beyond the glass. The alien lying on the medical bed looked nothing like the humanoid researchers around it. Its body was a complex network of iridescent scales and translucent membranes that pulsed with an uneven, struggling rhythm. Dr. Kiro Tanaka approached, his clipboard held tightly against his chest. His three-fingered hand tapped a series of data points, each touch creating a soft digital chime. "Cadet Park," he said, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and professional detachment. "You should not waste your time here." Jay didn't move. Her eyes continued to scan the patient's medical readouts, which danced across multiple holographic screens. The displays told a grim story: neurological collapse, cellular degradation, systems shutting down one by one. "The Verzak syndrome is always fatal," Kiro continued. "In the last 300 years, no patient has survived beyond 72 hours after initial diagnosis. This patient has less than 12 hours remaining. A lesser student might have looked away, might have accepted the inevitable, but Jay Park was different. She saw patterns where others saw only chaos. Her fingers traced invisible lines in the air, connecting the seemingly random data points that flickered across the medical screens. Something was off. Something didn't add up. The patient was a diplomatic courier from the Lyrian Confederacy, middle-aged by their species standards, which meant approximately 180 standard Earth years. Prior medical records showed a completely healthy individual until 3 days ago, when the first symptoms appeared. Sudden neural disruption, rapid cellular breakdown, complete system failure. Every medical professional in the academy had already written this patient off as a lost cause, except Ja. She remembered her grandmother's stories, stories about human medical miracles, about bodies that refused to give up, about immune systems that could fight back against impossible odds. Modern medical technology was impressive, but humans had something more, something that couldn't be measured by standard diagnostic tools. Persistence. "Dr. Tanaka," Jay said quietly, her eyes still locked on the patient, "I want to run additional tests." Kiro laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that echoed through the sterile medical wing. "Additional tests. For what purpose?" "The diagnosis is clear. The patient is dying." Hannah Kim, another researcher standing nearby, looked up from her own console. She had been quietly observing the exchange, her expression a mix of curiosity and professional interest. Unlike Kiro, she saw something in Jay's determination. "What are you seeing?" Hannah asked. Her question was genuine, without a hint of mockery. Jay pointed to a series of microscopic cellular readings. "These neural pathway disruptions, they're not random. There's a pattern here. A very specific pattern that suggests the body is trying to fight back." Kiro scoffed. "Trying to fight back? It's losing. It has already lost." But Hannah moved closer, her own specialized scanner moving over the holographic displays. Her breathing changed. Something in the data was catching her attention. The patient's body continued to pulse. Weak, struggling, but not entirely defeated. Jai knew she had moments to make a decision that could change everything. Moments to challenge centuries of medical understanding. Moments to prove that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible was merely something that hadn't been attempted yet. Her hand hovered over the diagnostic interface. One touch could set everything in motion. The research lab buzzed with quiet tension. Jade Park stood next to a complex holographic display, her fingers moving quickly across multiple data streams. Siak Lee, her closest friend and fellow medical cadet, watched her with a mix of admiration and worry. "You're going to get into trouble," Siak warned, leaning against a nearby workstation. "The entire medical board has already declared this case hopeless." Jay didn't look up. Her eyes remained fixed on the intricate cellular models spinning in the air before her. "Hope is not a medical strategy," she muttered, "but neither is giving up." The patient's medical file was a nightmare of complex data. Verzek syndrome was known as the silent destroyer among interstellar medical researchers. It attacked neural pathways with a precision that seemed almost intelligent. Most species simply shut down. Their bodies would stop fighting, and death would follow quickly. But humans were different. Hannah Kim entered the lab, her movement careful and deliberate. She carried a portable scanner and a stack of old medical journals. "I brought some historical records," she said, placing the materials on the workstation. "Unusual cases. Outliers." Kiro Tanaka followed behind her, his expression a mixture of skepticism and barely contained frustration. "This is a waste of resources," he announced to the room. "We have limited research time, and Cadet Park wants to chase impossible theories." Jay didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she pulled up a series of comparative charts. Human medical history was filled with cases where patients survived conditions that should have been fatal. Spontaneous remissions, unexpected recoveries. The human body had a reputation for breaking scientific rules. "Look here," she said, pointing to a complex molecular diagram. "The Verzek syndrome attacks neural connections in a specific pattern. But human neural networks are different, more flexible, more adaptive." Siok moved closer, his curiosity overcoming his initial skepticism. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we might be able to create a treatment that doesn't just fight the syndrome," Jay explained, "but redirects it. Use the body's own adaptive mechanisms as a weapon." Hannah's eyes widened. She understood immediately what Jay was proposing. It was radical, completely outside standard medical protocols, which meant it just might work. Kiro laughed. It was a sharp, dismissive sound. "Adaptive mechanisms. This is science, not science fiction. The patient will be dead within hours." But Jay had already begun preparing her initial treatment protocols. Her hands moved with a mixture of precision and passion. Each selection, each adjustment was calculated but carried an underlying sense of hope. The medical computer began running simulations. Thousands of potential scenarios played out in milliseconds. Most ended in failure, but a few, just a few, showed promise. "I'll need permission to proceed," Jay said quietly. "And I'll need to move fast." Siok leaned in, his voice low. "The medical board will never approve this." A small smile crossed Jay's face. "Then we won't ask the medical board." Hannah looked between Jay and Siok, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You're going to do this anyway, aren't you?" Jay's fingers hovered over the final confirmation button. One touch would change everything. One touch could save a life, or end a promising medical career. The patient's life support systems continued their steady, monotonous beeping, a countdown to what everyone believed was inevitable. Everyone except Jay Park. The medical chamber was silent except for the soft hum of advanced equipment. Dr. Yim Choi stood at the observation window, her arms crossed, watching carefully as Jay Park prepared her experimental treatment. "This is your last chance to back down," Dr. Choi said, her voice calm but firm. "Once we start this procedure, there's no turning back." Jay's hands moved with practiced precision. Small vials of carefully prepared solution lined the medical tray. Each one represented months of hidden research, stolen moments between standard classes, and countless sleepless nights. The patient lay motionless on the medical bed. Its alien body, a complex network of iridescent scales and translucent membranes, looked fragile. Monitoring devices covered every inch of skin, each one tracking the rapid decline of vital systems. Hannah Kim adjusted the final calibrations on the medical interface. "Cellular degradation is accelerating," she reported. Her voice was professional, but a hint of tension betrayed her underlying concern. Kiro Tanaka watched from the side, his three-fingered hands clasped behind his back. 37 minutes, he stated flatly. "That's how long the patient has left according to every known medical standard." Jay didn't respond. Her focus was absolute. The treatment she had developed was unlike anything in standard medical practice. Instead of fighting the Verzek syndrome directly, she planned to redirect its destructive energy. It was like trying to guide a hurricane instead of stopping it. Dangerous, unpredictable, but potentially revolutionary. Initiating first-stage treatment, Jay announced. A series of ultra-fine nanomolecular injectors descended toward the patient. Each one carried a complex cocktail of synthetic and biological compounds designed to interact with the patient's failing neural networks. Siak Lee watched the monitors closely. Cellular responses, unusual, he muttered. The first injection went in. For a moment, nothing happened. The patient's vital signs remained unchanged. Then, something shifted. The monitoring screens flickered. Data points began to dance in unexpected patterns. Where there should have been complete system failure, there was something else. Impossible, Kiro whispered. Dr. Choi leaned closer to the observation window. Her professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a hint of genuine surprise. The patient's neural pathways started to show unexpected activity. Not healing, exactly, but not dying either. It was as if the body was learning, adapting, fighting back in a way no one had ever seen before. The syndrome is changing, Hannah said, her voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. It's not destroying. It's transforming. Jay remained calm. This was exactly what she had hoped might happen. Humans had always been different. Their bodies were not just biological machines. They were living, thinking, adapting systems. Kiro moved closer to the monitoring screens. This defies everything we know about medical science, he said, his earlier skepticism replaced by something closer to wonder. Another injection. The patient's body responded again. Subtle movements, microscopic changes in cellular structures, nothing dramatic, but definitely not the total collapse everyone had predicted. 2 minutes, Siak announced, tracking the original estimated time of death. 2 minutes passed, then 5, then 10. The patient was still alive. Jay allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Not a victory, not yet, but definitely not a defeat. Something extraordinary was happening, and it was just the beginning. Alarms screamed through the medical chamber. Red warning lights flashed across every screen, painting the room in a harsh, angry glow. Cellular collapse is accelerating, Hannah Kim shouted, her hands flying across the medical interface. Something's going wrong. The patient's body began to convulse. Iridescent scales rippled and shifted in ways that defied normal biological movement. Where moments before there had been hope, now there was pure chaos. Jay Park stood frozen for just a heartbeat. Every medical instinct told her to stop, to retreat, to admit defeat. She did not. Siak, she called to her friend, her voice calm despite the pandemonium. Get me the backup molecular stabilizers. Dr. Yun Choi moved closer to the observation window. Her hand was already reaching for the emergency shutdown protocol. One touch would end the entire experiment. One touch would mean giving up. Kiro Tanaka's three-fingered hand was already moving toward the shutdown switch. This is over, he declared. The patient is dying. Your experiment has failed. But Jay was watching something else. While everyone else saw disaster, she saw a pattern. Complicated, complex, but definitely a pattern. Wait, she said, her hand shooting out to stop Kiro. Look at the cellular regeneration markers. The medical screens told a story that nobody wanted to hear. The Verzak syndrome was changing. Not dying. Not losing. Changing. Siak rushed back with the molecular stabilizers. His face was pale, but his hands were steady. What do you need me to do? Jay's fingers moved across the medical interface with lightning speed. She was rewriting treatment protocols in real time. Each adjustment was a calculated risk. Each moment could mean the difference between total failure and something extraordinary. The syndrome isn't attacking, she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. It's communicating. Hannah looked up, confusion written across her face. Communicating? That's not possible. But in the world of interstellar medicine, impossible was just another challenge waiting to be solved. The patient's body continued to change. What had started as violent convulsions was becoming something else. Controlled, deliberate, almost intelligent. Cellular integrity at 42%, Siok reported. The number was dropping fast. Dr. Choi stepped forward. Cadet Park, you need to make a decision. Now. Jay's mind raced. Everything she knew about medical science said to stop, to shut down the experiment, to accept defeat. But humans were different. Humans didn't know how to give up. Increase molecular stabilization by 0.3%, she commanded. And prepare the quantum resonance buffer. Kiro laughed. It was a sharp, bitter sound. You're going to kill the patient. No, Jay responded, her eyes never leaving the medical screens. I'm going to save them. The medical chamber held its breath. Machines continued to scream their warnings. The patient's body continued its impossible transformation. And in the center of it all, Jay Park stood her ground. One way or another, something was about to change. 12 hours had passed since the experimental treatment began. The medical chamber looked like a battlefield. Broken diagnostic equipment littered the floor. Holographic displays flickered with half-completed data streams. And at the center of it all, the patient lay completely still. Dr. Yun Choi walked slowly around the medical bed. Her eyes were tired but focused. Explain to me, she said to Jay Park, exactly what happened. Jay's uniform was wrinkled. Her hair had escaped its tight ponytail. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. Which, technically, she hadn't. The Verzak syndrome isn't a disease, she began. It's a communication system. Kiro Tanaka, who had been silent for hours, suddenly laughed. It was a tired, broken sound. Communication. It nearly killed the patient. Hannah Kim stepped forward, her medical scanner in hand. But it didn't, she said quietly. The patient is stable. The alien patient looked different now. Its iridescent scales had changed color. Where before they were a dull gray, now they shimmered with soft blues and greens. The translucent membranes that had been weak and fragile now looked strong and flexible. Siok Lee was reviewing the medical data. Cellular regeneration is at 89%, he reported. Completely impossible according to every medical textbook. Jay walked to the main display. With a few quick touches, she brought up a complex molecular diagram. The Verzak syndrome isn't trying to destroy, she explained. It's trying to upgrade. The room went silent. Upgrade? Dr. Choi asked. Think of it like a computer system, Jay continued. When a computer system encounters a problem, it doesn't just break down. It tries to find a way to solve the problem. To become better. Kiro moved closer to the display. His skepticism was slowly being replaced by something else. Curiosity. The syndrome attacked the patient's neural pathways, Jay explained, but not to destroy them. It was trying to find a way to make them stronger, more adaptable. Hannah's eyes were wide. Like how human bodies adapt to different environments, she asked. Jay nodded. Exactly. Most species see a threat and shut down. Humans see a challenge and find a way to overcome it. The patient's breathing had become steady, regular, something that had been impossible just hours before. We need to study this, Dr. Choi said. Her voice was careful, professional, but underneath, there was excitement. Siok looked up from the medical data. The medical board is going to lose their minds, he said with a small smile. Kiro, who had been the most skeptical, now looked thoughtful. This changes everything we know about interstellar medicine, he muttered. Jay didn't respond. Her attention was on the patient, on the impossible thing they had just accomplished. Outside the medical chamber, the first rays of sunlight began to break through the academy's massive windows. A new day was beginning, and everything had changed. The patient's eyes opened. For the first time in days, they were clear, focused, alive. The medical conference hall was packed. Researchers from a dozen different alien species sat in tense silence. Some looked curious, some looked angry, most looked confused. Jay Park stood at the center of the stage. Behind her, Massive holographic displays showed complex medical data. Her hands were steady. Her voice was clear. "The Verzak syndrome is not a disease," she began. "It's a biological communication system." A Trill researcher in the front row raised a hand. "That's impossible," he interrupted. "We've studied this syndrome for centuries." Jay didn't miss a beat. Impossible is just a word people use when they don't understand something yet. Siak Lee sat in the front row, watching carefully. He knew how much was riding on this presentation. An entire medical understanding was about to be challenged. The holographic displays began to show molecular interactions. Complex patterns danced in the air, showing how the Verzak syndrome worked at a cellular level. It wasn't destruction. It was something else entirely. "Most species see the syndrome as an attack," Jay continued. "We saw it as a problem to be solved." Hannah Kim stood nearby, ready to support Ja with additional data. Her eyes were bright with excitement. This was more than just a medical presentation. This was a moment that could change everything. Dr. Yun Choi watched from the side of the stage. She had fought to get Jay this opportunity. Many had said it was impossible. Many had wanted to shut down the entire research project. Kiro Tanaka, who had been the most skeptical, now looked thoughtful. His three-fingered hands were clasped together, his attention completely focused on Jay's presentation. "The human approach is different," Jay explained. "Where other species see a threat, we see a challenge. Where others see a problem, we see an opportunity." The conference hall was absolutely silent. The holographic displays showed the patient's recovery, step by step, moment by moment. What had been considered impossible was now proven possible. "This isn't just about one patient," Jay said. "This is about understanding how biological systems can adapt, how they can communicate, how they can grow." A Zorn researcher from the diplomatic corps raised a hand. "You're suggesting we've been wrong about medical science for centuries." Jay smiled. "I'm suggesting we've been looking at the problem from the wrong angle." The displays behind her showed complex molecular interactions. Blues and greens and reds danced together, showing how the Verzak syndrome could be understood as a communication system rather than a destructive force. "Most species run from a challenge," Jay said. "Humans run toward it." Siok caught her eye and gave a small nod of support. The conference hall began to buzz with conversation. Some researchers looked angry. Some looked excited. But nobody could ignore what they had just seen. Dr. Choi stepped forward. "Cadet Park will now take questions," she announced. The first hand went up, then another, and another. Jay took a deep breath. This was just the beginning. 3 weeks after the conference, Jay Park sat in a small research lab. Stacks of data tablets surrounded her. Holographic displays flickered with endless streams of medical information. The patient was awake and talking. "I remember everything," the alien patient told her. His name was Ren, a diplomatic courier from the Lyrian Confederacy. His body had changed completely since the treatment. Hannah Kim entered the lab, carrying fresh research documents. "The medical board wants another review," she said, dropping a thick folder on the table. Ja looked up. Her eyes were tired but determined. "They want to understand how we did it." The truth was complicated. What had started as an experimental treatment had become something much bigger, a breakthrough that challenged everything medical science thought it knew about biological systems. Siak Lee walked in with several data cubes. "The initial research findings are incredible," he reported. "Every major medical institution wants to study our approach." Kiro Tanaka followed behind him. The alien researcher who had been most skeptical was now one of their strongest supporters. "We've been looking at medical science all wrong," he said, shaking his head. Ren, the patient, sat up carefully. His body was still adapting, still changing, but he was alive. Something everyone had thought impossible just weeks ago. "The syndrome wasn't trying to kill me," Ren explained. "It was trying to communicate, to upgrade my biological systems." Dr. Yun Choi entered the lab. She carried herself differently now. There was pride in her movement, pride in what Jay had discovered. The implications are massive, Dr. Choi said. This isn't just about one medical treatment. This is about understanding how biological systems can communicate and adapt. Joe looked at the complex molecular displays. Each one told a story of transformation, of possibility. Humans have always been different, she said quietly. We don't see problems. We see challenges to be solved. The research lab was filled with equipment from a dozen different alien species, advanced medical technology that represented hundreds of years of scientific development. And yet, the most important breakthrough had come from a simple human approach. Hannah began preparing new research protocols. We need to study how this communication system works, she said. Every new piece of data changes what we understand. Siak was already uploading research findings to the central database. The medical community is going crazy, he reported. Nobody knows what to make of this. Kiro looked at Ja. The skepticism was completely gone from his eyes. You've changed everything, he said simply. Ren stood up. His movements were still careful, but strong. I was supposed to die, he said. Now I'm living proof that everything can change. The holographic displays continued to dance with molecular information, blues and greens and reds showing complex interactions that no one had understood before. This is just the beginning, Jay said. Outside the research lab, the Sunspire Academy continued its work. Researchers from a dozen worlds walked its halls. But something had changed, something fundamental. A human had shown them a new way of seeing the universe, and nothing would be the same again. The Interstellar Medical Council chamber was not built for drama. Cold metal walls, flat white floors, holographic displays that showed nothing but pure clinical information. But today was different. Jay Park stood alone at the center of the massive circular room. 12 representatives from different alien species sat in a perfect circle around her. Their eyes were hard. Their expressions were unreadable. You are suggesting, said the Zorn representative, his voice like grinding metal, that everything we know about medical science is wrong. Jay did not flinch. Not wrong, she corrected. Incomplete. Siak Lee watched from a side chamber. His hand was pressed against the transparent wall. Hannah Kim stood next to him, her fingers crossed tightly. Our patient is alive, Jay continued. Not just alive, transformed. The Verzak syndrome wasn't a killer. It was a communication system. A holographic display behind her showed molecular interactions, complex patterns that danced and shifted, blues and greens and reds showing how biological systems could talk to each other in ways nobody had understood before. The Trill representative leaned forward. Explain, he demanded. Jay took a deep breath. Most species see a threat and shut down, she said. Humans see a challenge and find a way through. Our bodies don't just defend. They communicate. They adapt. Kiro Tanaka sat among the council members, where once he had been her biggest critic. Now he was her strongest supporter. He nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue. This isn't about one medical breakthrough, Jay explained. This is about understanding how life works, how biological systems can grow, can change, can become something more. The room was silent. Dr. Yun Choi watched from the shadows. She knew what this moment meant. This was more than a medical hearing. This was a moment that could change everything. We have the medical records, the Zorn representative said. We have the patient's testimony. We have your research. He paused. But we do not understand. Jay smiled. Understanding comes from being willing to look at things differently, she said. The holographic displays continued to shift, molecular patterns showing how the human approach was different, how humans saw challenges as opportunities, how the human body was not just a system, but a living, thinking, adapting network. Our patient was supposed to die, Jay said. Instead, he's living proof that everything can change. Ren, the patient, sat in the back of the chamber. His body still showed signs of transformation, proof of what Jay had discovered. The Trill representative whispered something to the Zorn representative. Their conversation was too quiet to hear. Suk's hand was still pressed against the wall. Hannah stood close, her breath caught in her throat. Minutes passed. Seconds felt like hours. Finally, the Zorn representative spoke. "We will review your full research," he said, completely and carefully. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it was a beginning. J. Park stood tall. Behind her, the molecular displays continued to dance, showing a universe of possibility, of adaptation, of hope. 6 months later, the Sunspire Academy looked different. A new research wing stood where empty space had been before. Massive windows reflected the light of 3 different suns. Inside, researchers from a dozen different alien species worked together. J. Park walked through the hallway. Her medical cadet uniform had been replaced by a research director's coat. Things had changed. Everything had changed. Ren, the patient who had started it all, was now a research assistant. His body continued to adapt, to change, to grow. "We've identified 3 more communication systems," he told Jai, showing her a data tablet. "Each one works differently, but they all follow the same basic principle." Siak Lee looked up from a nearby workstation. "The principle of adaptation," he said. Hannah Kim was reviewing molecular displays. Complex interactions that nobody had understood before were now becoming clear. "It's not about fighting," she explained to a group of new researchers. "It's about understanding." Kiro Tanaka entered the lab. Where once he had been a skeptic, now he was a key member of the research team. "The Interstellar Medical Council has approved our new research protocols," he announced. Dr. Yun Choi followed behind him. Her position had changed too. She was now the lead of the most important medical research center in the known galaxy. "Humans have always been different," Dr. Choi said, looking at Jia. "Where others see limits, you see possibilities." The research wing was alive with activity. Holographic displays showed molecular interactions, complex systems that danced and shifted, blues and greens and reds, showing how life could communicate in ways nobody had understood before. Jia looked out the window. 3 suns burned in the distance. Alien landscapes stretched as far as the eye could see. "We're just getting started," she said quietly. Ren smiled. His body was still changing, still adapting. "Nobody thought this was possible," he said. "Now it's happening every day." The research teams worked together. Humans, aliens, species that had been separate for centuries now working as one, all because of a simple idea, a human idea. Challenges were not meant to be avoided. They were meant to be solved. Siok brought over a new set of research findings. "We've identified 5 more potential communication systems," he reported. Each one unique, each one showing how life can adapt. Hannah was already preparing new research protocols. "We need to study more," she said. "We've only scratched the surface." Kiro looked at the molecular displays. The skepticism was completely gone from his eyes. "Humans see the universe differently," he said. "And now we all can learn from that." Outside, the 3 suns continued to burn. Alien landscapes stretched to the horizon. Inside the research wing, something important was happening. Something revolutionary. The universe was learning to communicate, and it had started with one human who refused to give up. J. Park smiled. This was just the beginning.